in a land where kings rose in cruelty and the people of God cried out in silence. One man, overlooked, underestimated, and left-handed, would become the weapon of divine justice. This is not just a story of a man with a dagger. This is the story of a people who turned away from their God, and how mercy found them in the form of an assassin. This is the cinematic retelling of Ehud, the left-handed deliverer, and the fat king who never saw him coming. If you love immersive biblical stories filled with drama, suspense, and divine power, subscribe now. More epic stories like this are on the way. The sun scorched the hills of Israel, casting long shadows across the cracked soil. It had been years since the Israelites had seen true peace. The days of Joshua were now stories told around dying fires, whispers of a golden era fading from memory. The promised land, Canaan, once flowing with milk and honey, now groaned under the weight of rebellion. Not rebellion against foreign kings, but against the very God who had delivered them. The people had turned their hearts away from the Lord, bowing to the carved idols of neighboring nations. They danced in the temples of Baal and burned incense before the Asherah poles, forgetting the one who split seas and tore down walls. Sin crept into their homes like a silent serpent, coiling itself around their spirits. And when a nation turns its back on God, the consequences always follow. In the east, beyond the Jordan River, a king was rising. His name was Eglon, and he ruled over the land of Moab. He was not a man of swift conquests or clever diplomacy. He was a man of appetite. His desires were vast, for food, for power, for domination. And though his body grew wide and sluggish, his ambitions were sharp and cruel. Eglon had long watched Israel with greedy eyes. He saw their division, their weakness, their sin. He knew they had abandoned the God of their fathers, and in their spiritual vulnerability, he saw an open gate. With cunning, Eglon forged alliances with two ancient enemies of Israel, Ammon and Amalek. The three powers, bound not by loyalty but by mutual hatred for Israel, gathered their forces like a storm gathering above the desert. The armies crossed the Jordan, swift and merciless, and took the city of palms, Jericho, the very place where Israel had once seen the walls fall with a shout. Now those walls belonged to Eglon. He set up a throne there, a grotesque seat built from marble and gold, inlaid with Moabite symbols of fertility and war. He laughed as he sat upon it, his belly spilling over the edges, his fingers adorned with rings soaked in blood. Israel was under his thumb, and he pressed hard. The yoke of Moab was heavy, not just in taxation but in humiliation. Israel was forced to send annual tributes, grain, livestock, silver, and spices to feed the insatiable appetite of Eglon. Moabite soldiers patrolled their towns. Their children were taken as servants, their women dishonored. Their prophets were silenced, hope decayed like rotting fruit on a forgotten vine. Every year, a delegation from Israel was sent to deliver the tribute, and every year the same fear gripped their hearts as they approached the walls of Jericho, where Eglon waited with oily smiles and sharpened spears. In the quiet corners of the land, however, not all bowed in despair. There were whispers, prayers, and cries in the night that rose to heaven. In a modest town nestled among the hills of Benjamin lived a man named Ehud. He was not a mighty warrior nor a son of great fame. In fact, he was considered peculiar by many. His left hand, his dominant hand, was seen as a weakness in a world that favored the right. But what others saw as a flaw, God would use as a weapon. Ehud was quiet, observant. He watched the Moabite soldiers with cold eyes. He memorized their routines, their armor, the blind spots in their patrols. He trained in the shadows, slicing through the air with wooden blades, learning to strike with silence. And though he had never taken a life, he dreamed of freedom, of blood being spilled not by Israel, but for Israel. Each time the elders returned from Jericho with heads bowed low and eyes filled with shame, Ehud's fists clenched. He could not accept this. He would not. Israel had once toppled empires. Why now did they tremble before a fat king on a stolen throne? Then, one night, as he walked the rocky trails under a silver moon, he dropped to his knees. His voice cracked with the weight of sorrow as he prayed, "Lord, have you forgotten us? Have you turned your face from your people forever? Look at us, chained, humiliated. Our children do not even remember your name. We cry out to you, not with sacrifices, but with broken hearts. Deliver us. Raise up a hand to strike our enemy down. Raise up a savior, even if that savior is me." The wind answered with silence, but in the courts of heaven, the cry had reached the ears of the Almighty. And God, slow to anger and rich in mercy, responded, not with fire or flood, but with a man wielding a hidden blade and a left hand strong with purpose. Weeks passed. The oppression continued, but Ehud was no longer the same. Something stirred in his soul, a fire kindled by divine purpose. One morning, as he sat among the elders, they discussed the coming tribute mission. Another journey to Jericho, another offering to Eglon. As they debated who should go, a voice broke through the murmurs. "I will take the tribute," Ehud said, his eyes firm. The room fell silent. "You?" an elder asked. "Why you, son of Gera?" Ehud stood unflinching. "Because I am ready. I know the path. I have studied the customs, and I will return swiftly." They exchanged glances. Though some doubted, they agreed. The tribute must be delivered, and few volunteered for such a burden. That night, alone in his house, Ehud knelt before a wooden bench. Upon it lay a slab of iron, a hammer, and a stone for sharpening. He worked until the stars faded. When dawn came, a dagger lay gleaming in his hands. It was double-edged, its blade honed to a whisper-sharp edge. 18 inches in length, long enough to reach the heart. The handle was smooth, wrapped in leather. There was no sheath. This weapon was not meant to be displayed. It was meant to be hidden, buried against his right thigh, where no guard would think to search a man who fought with his left. Ehud tied it under his tunic and stepped into the morning light, unaware that history would soon remember him not just as a deliverer, but as an assassin. The road from Benjamin to Jericho wound through ravines and olive groves. The tribute caravan traveled in silence, weighed down by carts of grain and jugs of oil. Ehud led them, eyes scanning the cliffs above and the valleys below. Every step toward Jericho felt like walking into the jaws of death. As they neared the city, the watchtowers loomed, dark and menacing. Moabite flags flapped in the breeze, red with the emblem of a raging bull. The gates creaked open, revealing the bustle of a foreign court. Moabite merchants shouted in harsh tongues. Slaves, both Hebrew and pagan, moved like ghosts through the streets. The tribute was received with mockery. The guards laughed as they counted the offerings. One spat in the dust before Ehud's feet. Another grabbed a jug of wine and took a swig before tossing it aside. Still, Ehud said nothing. They were led to the palace, an obscene structure, gilded and adorned with grotesque statues. Inside, the air was thick with incense and sweat. The courtiers, fat and perfumed, lounged on cushions, their eyes lazy and cruel. Then came the voice, high-pitched, petulant. "Bring them forward. Let me see what Israel has brought for my table." King Eglon sat atop his throne, a mountain of flesh wrapped in silk. Rolls of fat rippled as he laughed, his beady eyes narrowing as he saw the delegation. "So, the dogs return. And what bone have you brought for me today?" Ehud stepped forward. He bowed. "Your tribute, O king. May it please you." Eglon licked his lips. "It always does." The tribute was laid before him. Silver coins clinked. Dried figs spilled across the marble. Eglon motioned lazily, and servants gathered the goods. "You may leave now," the king said with a dismissive wave. "Return to your pitiful land." Ehud bowed again. but inside, he was already planning his next move. The blade was still strapped to his thigh, and his mission was not yet complete. The caravan left Jericho under a blood-red sunset, their task complete, or so it seemed. The men, though worn and uneasy, were eager to return to their families, but Ehud lagged behind. His heart thudded like war drums in his chest. The dagger was still strapped under his robe, pressing against his thigh, a cold reminder that his mission had only begun. As the group approached the stone idols at Gilgal, strange monoliths left by earlier generations, Ehud halted. "You go ahead," he told them. "I forgot something." One of the men turned. "Ehud, I'll catch up. Go." There was something in his voice, steel beneath the calm. They nodded and continued down the path, casting glances over their shoulders as he turned back toward Jericho. Ehud walked alone now, the shadows growing long as the city re-emerged in the distance. The walls loomed once more, and with each step, his thoughts raced. "This is madness. I should return. What if I fail? What if I am caught?" But another voice answered, quiet yet burning. "You asked to be the one. You cried out to God. This is your moment." The guards at Jericho were surprised, but said nothing as Ehud requested another audience with the king. One of them raised an eyebrow at the sight of the lone Israelite. "What is it this time?" Ehud bowed slightly. "A secret message, for the king alone." The words sparked curiosity. The guard scratched his beard, then nodded. "Wait here." Minutes later he returned, motioning Ehud forward. "Come, the king will see you." Ehud was led through long corridors of stone and tapestry deeper into the bowels of the palace. They stopped before a private chamber, an upper room where the king would often rest away from the noise of court. The air was thick with perfume, and the walls were adorned with images of Moabite gods, twisted, leering things. Inside, Eglon sat on a cushioned chair, his massive body sinking into the layers of fabric and flesh. Two guards stood nearby, but Eglon raised a hand. "Leave us." "But, Your Majesty," I said, "leave." Reluctantly, the guards withdrew and closed the doors behind them. The room fell silent. Only the muffled hum of the city far below broke the stillness. Ehud stepped forward. "I have a message from God for you," he said. Eglon raised an eyebrow, his lips curling. "From your God?" Ehud's eyes locked with his. "Yes, a message just for you." He reached beneath his robes slowly, his left hand moving to the hidden dagger. The king, thinking nothing of it, leaned forward. And then, in a flash, steel sang. Ehud drove the dagger deep into the folds of Eglon's belly. The blade disappeared, swallowed by the mountain of flesh. The king's eyes bulged. He gasped, tried to scream, but only a gurgle escaped. Ehud twisted the handle once. Blood and fat erupted from the wound. Eglon's massive body quivered, then slumped. He was dead. The room began to stink. The wound had burst something inside the king. His bowels emptied as he died, and the stench filled the air. Ehud yanked at the dagger, but the folds of flesh had closed around it. It would not come free. Leave it. There was no time. Ehud crossed to the doors and locked them from the inside, then slipped silently through a narrow passage behind the chamber, an exit he had noted earlier in the day. A servant's corridor, forgotten, dimly lit. He crept through it like a shadow, emerging into the outer halls. No one stopped him. No one suspected. The palace buzzed with meaningless chatter. Eglon's death, for now, remained hidden behind locked doors. Outside, the city was alive with noise. The scent of roasting meat filled the streets. Moabite soldiers lounged at gates and women sang in foreign tongues. Ehud kept his hood low, his pace steady. He passed the guards. He passed the outer walls. And then he was free. He broke into a run, his sandals pounding the dusty earth. Past the monuments of Gilgal, through the night, toward Sirah, in the hill country of Ephraim, to war. Back in the palace, time dragged. Eglon's guards waited outside the chamber, confused by the long silence. One finally knocked. No answer. He tried the handle. Locked. Another snorted. Maybe he's relieving himself. They laughed, shaking their heads. It was not uncommon for the king to sit for long stretches in privacy. Minutes passed, then an hour, but something felt wrong. At last, the guards fetched a key. When they opened the doors, the stench hit them like a wave. Flies buzzed over the bloated corpse. Blood soaked the floor. Eglon's eyes stared blankly at the ceiling, and the assassin was long gone. At Sarah, Ehud raised a ram's horn to his lips. He blew. A piercing cry echoed through the mountains. Israelite men, farmers, shepherds, former soldiers came from the hills and fields. They gathered around him, drawn by the sound. His eyes were fierce, his hands still trembling from the kill. "Follow me," he cried, "for the Lord has delivered Moab into your hands." He led them down the mountain paths, swift and silent, to the fords of the Jordan River. There, they blocked every crossing point. No Moabite could flee. They set up ambushes, traps, and waited. Soon, the panic in Jericho would spill outward. Moabite soldiers would try to escape, and they would be met with blades. As Ehud ran through the wilderness, each stride taking him farther from Jericho, the memory of what he had done burned bright in his mind, not with guilt, but with a fire that no water could quench. He replayed the moment again and again, how the king leaned forward, how the dagger pierced, how the life left Eglon's eyes. He hadn't just killed a man, he had slain a tyrant. It had not been vengeance, not bloodlust, but divine judgment. The blade had been wielded by a left hand, but guided by heaven itself. Back in that chamber, the world had stood still. The king had grunted once, like a beast struck low. His arms had flailed, then gone slack. The folds of his stomach had seemed to swallow the blade, almost as if the weapon itself had disappeared into a tomb of flesh. And the smell, Ehud would never forget it. He had stumbled back a step, chest heaving, as the air grew thick with the odor of death and waste. But he hadn't faltered. With steady hands, he had turned to the doors and bolted them shut from within. No time for trophies. No time to retrieve the dagger. Only time for silence and escape. The locked doors had bought precious minutes. Outside, the Moabite guards had snickered, exchanging lewd jokes. "The king is indisposed," one said, smirking. "He always takes his time after eating, probably asleep on the throne." But as time dragged on, discomfort grew. Finally, one of them stepped forward, knocked softly. "Your Majesty?" No answer. Another knock, louder this time. Still silence. They exchanged glances. One of them sniffed the air and winced. "That smell. It's worse than usual. Maybe something's wrong." "No," the commander snapped. "Do not disturb him. You know how he gets when he's interrupted." So they waited, minutes stretching like hours. Only when the stink became unbearable and the silence too long to ignore did they retrieve a key. By then, it was far too late. They burst in and gasped in horror. The king lay dead, motionless in his own filth. His face was pale, his eyes glassy. The dagger was embedded deep, the hilt swallowed by flesh. The blood had stopped flowing. It had been too long. Ehud was gone, and the assassinated king's death would echo through the land like thunder. At the foot of the mountains of Ephraim, Ehud stood like a blazing fire. The trumpet had sounded, and Israel had answered. Men gathered in the shadows, men who had once fought under Joshua's command, now old and tired, yet with eyes that burned once more with purpose. Young men, too, eager and desperate, gripping farming tools and rusted swords. They all stared at Ehud, at his confidence, at the authority in his voice. He had done what no one else dared, and now he called them to finish the task. "The king of Moab is dead," he declared. "The guards will scatter, the generals will retreat. This is our chance." He raised a fist. "No more tribute, no more humiliation. Today we strike. Today the Jordan runs red with the blood of our oppressors." Shouts rose into the air. The army, small, ragged, but fierce, was ready. Ehud led them southward, toward the river crossings. The plan was clear: block the fords, trap the fleeing Moabites, leave no survivors. Just as Ehud predicted, panic erupted in Jericho. News of the king's death spread like wildfire. Moabite commanders shouted over one another. Soldiers fought to organize. Some tried to flee, others to defend. But leadership had died with Eglon. There was no strategy, only fear. Those who tried to escape eastward found themselves funneled toward the fords of the Jordan River, narrow, shallow crossings where men and horses had passed for centuries. But this time, Israel was waiting. Ehud had placed his men behind rocks and in trees. Boulders had been rolled across paths. Traps had been laid beneath foliage. And when the Moabite soldiers arrived, tired, confused, and desperate, they were met with death. The ambush was brutal. Ehud struck first, leaping from cover with a war cry that sent a chill through even his own men. "For the Lord." Swords clashed. Spears found their marks. The river turned crimson as body after body fell into its waters. 10,000 Moabite soldiers died that day. Not one escaped. They were strong, they were trained, but they were terrified. And Israel fought with the fury of a people unchained. By sundown, it was over. The battlefield was strewn with corpses, the scent of blood thick in the air. Crows circled above, their shrieks echoing through the twilight. Ehud stood among the fallen, chest heaving, blade dripping. His eyes scanned the horizon. No more Moabites came. Jericho, once a symbol of Israel's fall, was now silent. They had done it. The tyrant was dead, the army defeated, the tribute system destroyed, and all it had taken was one man with a hidden blade, a left hand, and the courage to obey. Ehud returned to the people, not with chains but with freedom. Word spread across Israel the Lord had raised up a deliverer. The land rejoiced. Families came out from hiding. Children danced in the streets. Elders wept. The idols were torn down. The altars of Baal were smashed. And once again Israel remembered their God. For 80 years there was peace. Ehud lived among his people, not as a king or a priest, but as a man who answered the call when others bowed in fear. He had no palace, no golden crown, only a legacy. The legacy of a left-handed assassin who delivered his people with a blade and a prayer. The battlefield lay still under the dawn sky. Ehud stood among the slain, the wind tugging at his tunic. All around him, the bodies of the Moabite soldiers lay broken. 10,000 strong, each one a part of the oppression that had choked his people for 18 long years. Their blood darkened the waters of the Jordan and soaked the soil beneath his feet. He dropped to his knees, not in exhaustion, but in reverence. He had seen death. He had delivered justice. But this victory belonged not to the sword, nor to the hand that wielded it. It belonged to God. "O Lord," he whispered, voice trembling, "we were nothing, yet you remembered us. You heard our cry. You gave us this day. May we never forget again." Behind him, the Israelite warriors stood quiet, humbled by the carnage, yet filled with awe. Not only had they won, they had witnessed something divine, a liberation born from courage, strategy, and a single act of obedience. Ehud rose, turned, and faced them. "It is finished," he said, "but our journey is not." Within hours, Ehud and a chosen group returned to Jericho, the city of palms. What once had been a seat of Moabite dominance now lay trembling and confused. The garrison was leaderless, and most Moabite officials had either fled or fallen in the river ambush. The people of Jericho emerged cautiously. Israelites who had been forced to serve and live under Eglon's rule. When they saw Ehud, they fell to their knees. "You've come," one whispered. "Is it true the king is dead?" Ehud nodded. "The yoke is broken. This land is ours again." What followed was not a massacre, but a cleansing. The idols of Moab were cast down. The golden bulls of Chemosh shattered. The incense altars smashed and burned. Ehud led the people in prayer atop the very palace where Eglon had gorged himself in arrogance and mockery. No longer would Jericho be a monument to Israel's shame. Now it was a symbol of restoration. In the weeks that followed, Israel slowly began to rise again. Farmers returned to their fields without fear. Families rebuilt their homes and cleared the rubble of war. The old roads were opened. Trade resumed, honest and fair. The songs of freedom echoed through villages and cities. More than anything, the people remembered. They remembered their covenant, their God, their deliverance. Ehud did not declare himself ruler, nor did he build a tower in his name. He returned to his village in the hill country of Benjamin, tending flocks, mentoring young men, and judging the people with wisdom and humility. He became a symbol of quiet strength, and from every corner of the land the story was told. Once we were slaves, once we were forgotten. But then the Lord raised up a man with a hidden blade and a burning heart, a left-handed warrior who struck down the oppressor in silence, and through him, God gave us peace. Years passed. One evening, as the stars bloomed over the hills of Ephraim, Ehud sat beside a fire with his son. The boy had grown into a man, strong, thoughtful, and proud of his father's legacy. But tonight, he had questions. "Father," he said, "do you ever think about that day, the day you killed the king?" Ehud stared into the fire for a long moment before replying. "I do, every night." "Do you regret it?" A slow breath, then no. "But I mourn what brought us there. A man like Eglon doesn't rise unless a people fall away. Israel forgot God. We bowed to idols, to foreign customs, to fear. We gave them the sword, and they turned it against us." The son nodded, quiet. "You didn't just kill a man," he said. "You gave us back our voice." Ehud looked at his son and smiled. "And now it's your turn to use it." Ehud grew old in peace. He judged Israel for many years, wisely and righteously. Under his leadership, the people did not return to idols. The memory of Moab's oppression lingered like a shadow, but it served as a reminder, never again. When he died, they buried him in the land of Benjamin, not with fanfare, but with reverence. The stone above his grave bore no titles, no boasts, only a simple inscription: Ehud, the left-handed son of Gera, servant of the Lord, deliverer of Israel. And even as generations passed, his story remained. It was told by warriors to their sons before battle, by elders to their grandchildren at twilight, by scribes who etched the truth into sacred scrolls. The tale of the left-handed assassin who killed a king with nothing but silence, courage, and a dagger, chosen not by strength, but by purpose. And in that story, Israel found not just a hero, but a warning and a promise. When God's people cry out in repentance, He always answers. Ehud's blade may have brought freedom, but it was repentance that restored a nation. His story reminds us that God does not need the strong, only the willing. That peace comes when we return to Him. Thank you for watching this epic journey through the book of Judges. If you were moved, inspired, or left breathless by this story, hit that subscribe button. Like, comment, and share this with someone who needs to know that even the quietest voice can be chosen for the loudest victory. This is just one chapter of many. More cinematic Bible stories are coming. Don't miss them.